You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you. It is Thursday, December 19th. That's when this is being recorded. So you may be listening to it on Thursday, you may be listening to it on Friday, but either way, it's either the day before or the day of the college football playoff matchup between Indiana and Notre Dame. We have had a full week of podcasts across the board. We've had Mitchell Page on. Scott and I sat down and talked about things. We had Taylor Lehman from Bite Size Bison. And, of course, we had Rhett Lewis yesterday talking about Indiana versus Notre Dame, talking about the matchup, talking about all of the things that you got to keep in mind with Indiana being in the college football playoff, the next step in what has been a remarkable, unprecedented, record-breaking season for Indiana football. And it's been just a blast. We're looking forward to heading up there actually a little bit later today. We've got a special guest joining us here in what is almost certainly going to be our last official podcast before the game. We got to pull up the stakes on the tents and pack them up and head up to the South Bend area. So probably not going to get a chance to do a lot more on the podcasting front, but wanted to talk before we get to our guest today about a few things that are going to be pertinent to you all as IU fans if you're heading up there. And even if you're not, just kind of knowing what's going on up there, I think is always helpful for those of you living vicariously through those of us that are going. First of all, just wanted to remind everybody we're part of the Back Home Network here at Crimson Cast. And you can access the Back Home Network through a variety of different portals. Of course, you can just subscribe to Crimson Cast on Spotify. But if you do that, you should also be subscribing to the Assembly Call, our partners there, subscribing to the Doing the Work podcast. So many different programs covering different aspects of IU athletics on the Back Home Network. One of my favorite places increasingly to go and where a lot of people are finding our content is on YouTube. If you search Back Home Network on YouTube, you'll find all of our content, live shows, pre-recorded shows, shorts, a little bit of everything. Over almost 7,000 people now in our YouTube community. We'd love to have you joining us there. If you want to see us talk as opposed to just listening to us talk, that's always an option. So go check out the Back Home Network on YouTube and hit the follow or subscribe button. We'd love to be able to deliver things directly to you through that. Of course, the entire Back Home Network is brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. And folks, it was exciting yesterday. I placed an order hoping that it was going to get here before I left for South Bend, and they did it. Home Field came through. You can see I've got one of the Indiana CFP hoodies. This is the red hoodie, beautiful design. It's got the CFP logo up here on that side. Maybe I'll learn how to use my hands eventually as I try to point these out. Beautiful IU helmet rendition and a larger college football playoff logo down below. There's other stuff. I got a long sleeve black Indiana CFP shirt. There's a white long sleeve one. There's a couple of white heavyweights and a couple of other crew necks and hoodies. Just Home Field hit it out of the park with the IU CFP apparel. You want to grab that as soon as you can because, look, let's be honest. Indiana will, of course, be in the CFP regularly moving forward, but there's only a first time once to be in the college football playoff, and this is it for IU. So grab some what will eventually be commemorative apparel of IU being in the college football playoff for the first time out of many. There's some great designs on there. Go to homefieldapparel.com, check them out. Follow them on Instagram, follow them on X. Use the code HOME23 and get 15% off your first order. Tell them that Crimson Cast sent you and pick yourself up some great apparel. Also, of course, great stuff across the board, not just IU gear, but for a bunch of other schools as well. Again, homefieldapparel.com. Also, just a reminder, we're on Substack. And if you want to check out what we're doing podcast-wise, head over to Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com. It's free to sign up, and you get podcasts delivered right to your inbox. It's helpful. That way you don't have to constantly check what's going on out there. We also do some VIP subscriber-only videos for those who would like to throw a little bit of money our way to help keep the lights on, keep the site hosting down, things like that. It's $5 a month, $50 a year. And we certainly appreciate all the folks that are in our Substack community. We've got over 1,100 people now subscribed to the Substack alone for Crimson Cast, and we've got a ton of subscribers who have been very generous and gracious with their time and money, and we certainly appreciate hearing from you folks in the chats and just getting to communicate with you folks a little bit more directly. So again, crimsoncast.substack.com. We'd love to have you as part of that community. All right, before we get to our guest, I wanted to give you all a rundown of where we're going to be and what to expect going up to South Bend. It's a little bit up in the air in terms of like what the pregame stuff's going to be, but I wanted to give you a rundown of what I know of at this point as of about 10 a.m. on Thursday morning. So this evening, if you're listening to this on Thursday, so Thursday evening, there is an event going on at Corby's Irish Pub in South Bend, and that is going to be a multi-branded event that Crimson Cast will be a part of. Home Field Apparel also sponsoring it, but the primary sponsor is the IU Alumni Association. And we would love to have you joining us and some of the IU alums that live in the South Bend area at that event. The event goes 5:30 to 8:30. The Crimson Cast traveling party is probably going to be getting there at about 7 o'clock, maybe slightly earlier. We'll be there for the last hour or so of the event. So please come by if you are in the vicinity and would like to connect with us. We would love to see you there. Again, that's going to be at Corby's Irish Pub, which is 441 East LaSalle Avenue in South Bend. There's going to be free home field gifts and surprises, exclusive home field discounts available for guests. No RSVP required. And again, 5:30 to 8:30, we'll be there for about the last hour, hour and a half. Would love to see you at that event if you're in the vicinity. On Friday at noon, join me and friends of Crimson Cast at Social Cantina in Mishawaka, Indiana. We will be holding an event. The event's going to go 12 to 4. I think the Crimson Cast party is going to be there about 12 to 2 or 12 to 2:30. Would love to connect with all you folks up there. It should be a lot of fun. There's supposed to be some former players there as well, some other surprises. But we're really excited to be partnering with Finney Hospitality and Social Cantina and IU Sports Properties on this one. So get over there in Mishawaka starting at noon on Friday. Great way to kick off what's going to be a long, exciting, and fruitful day of rooting for IU football. Later on that day, there's a lot of different things going on. Now, there's a big IU Alumni Association tent tailgate. That's sold out. Like, I didn't even get tickets for that. There's like 1,200 people going to that. But there's going to be so many other things going on. Keep an eye on the Crimson Cast Twitter feed. If you're not following along with that, we'll try to tweet out some information about where we're at, what's going on. There'll be some spontaneous tailgates that pop up in various places. There's also going to be several IU parties at some of the drinking establishments in South Bend and the surrounding area leading into the game. There's a ton of people coming to this game, folks. I think hopefully by now you're aware of that, but a ton of IU people planning on being there. And if you're still on the fence about going, I think you're at a point now where you kind of need to make a decision. We've been watching ticket prices throughout the course of the week. Tickets had descended a bit. They'd gotten down to about the $400 per ticket mark all in, and they seem to have gone back up again. Checking SeatGeek this morning, it's at $544 for the get-in price. So, just keep an eye on it. But, if you're going and you don't have a ticket, I'd hold off a little bit. Tickets might drop before kick. If you're thinking about going, it's going to be an amazing party. We would love to see you up there. So we'll see what happens with all of that. Should be a fascinating set of experiences awaiting us up in South Bend. As always, if you've got questions on anything, just try to hit us up on X. You can hit us up. I don't check my own Twitter account, the Dr. GC one, that much, but you can try DMing me there. We'll try to get in touch with you up in South Bend. Anyway, we'd love to see you all, and looking forward to having a big party up in South Bend as Indiana takes on Notre Dame. All right, we're going to go ahead and get to our guest for today, as we're going to be joined by NBC Sports Nicole Auerbach, who's been a consistent, rational voice in college football with the college football playoff with Indiana. You've heard her throughout the course of the season as she has provided commentary and analysis on what's going on with college football, what's going on with the Big Ten, and what's going on with Indiana in particular. So let's go ahead and bring Nicole on right after this. Okay, and joining us on the show for the first time, hopefully not the last time, we've got Nicole Auerbach joining us from NBC Sports College Football Insider. Nicole, thank you for taking the time to join us here on Crimson Cast.
Yeah, happy to do it.
So we're obviously going to talk about the matchup with Indiana and Notre Dame, but I wanted to, I guess, get your overall assessment on what this season's been like for Indiana so far and just this insane turnaround that the Hoosiers have seen under Curt Cignetti.
Yeah, it's really unbelievable. I mean, he was my National Coach of the Year pick. There were some great candidates this year. Kenny Dillingham did at ASU and Deion Sanders at Colorado. But like, this is the program that's lost more games than anybody else in college football history. So it's pretty obvious to me that it had to be Cignetti. And to not just get to double-digit wins for the very first time ever, but to clear that, get to 11, it's remarkable. I mean, it was. I was at the desk for Big Ten Network when he proclaimed a year ago that Indiana would be playing for a Big Ten championship in year one. And, we're all like, all right, like this guy, like, we're told like, okay, he's brash, he's quotable. But then he said something like that. And, I've talked to him about that moment a few times since. And he's like, listen, I could just tell that people didn't believe that these things were possible at Indiana. And I had to say stuff. I had to push it. I had to, get people excited about it. And it's wild to see that all could come together. And I just love the story overall of taking a bunch of guys with him from JMU, players and coaches, so you can kind of instill your culture quickly and like to the standard and the way that you want it to be, to have a bunch of group of 5 guys stepping up a level. Same with Curtis Rourke coming from the MAC, and for them to be having that kind of success at the Power 4 level. All of it's just such an incredible story. And then you watch them play. And I feel like there was a period of time we went this season that was like, all right, wow, Indiana won a couple games. Like, hey, great. Like, first year coach well, okay, this is like pretty good story. And like, all right, they're kind of crushing some of the bad Big Ten teams. Like, this is cool. They're going to go bowling. And then you watch them play, right? And you're like, oh, wow, they are like incredibly well prepared. They are incredibly disciplined. They are like so sound defensively and offensively. You just enjoy watching kind of Curtis Rourke and kind of like pick apart a defense. And then it gets to, okay, wow, they got a chance at the playoffs. So like there were a lot of phases that we went through this season, watching the national picture and watching Indiana's place in it.
It was certainly weird from the IU perspective because we were going through those same phases. I remember like being at the UCLA game and it was like, wow, they won an important road game. And I don't think anybody knew how bad UCLA was going to be at that point. But, then you get to the Northwestern game, they win that one. And it's like, well, they're bowl eligible. How far can this go? And I it was really interesting, and we certainly in the IU fan base appreciated your commentary on things because like there was this honeymoon period with IU from about the Nebraska game through the first college football playoff like projection or the first committee ranking, whereas like, oh, Indiana, what a great story. Then
they were behind. They were behind. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, but then it turned very quickly, and it was really fascinating watching like large sections of the college football media establishment just decide Indiana's the problem. I mean, what was your interpretation of all of that? Like it was wild to watch, like Indiana suddenly go from being the darlings of college football to somehow being all that was wrong with the playoff system.
That was unbelievable. That was such a weird like 2-week period of the season. And it was so confusing to me because they were about to play Ohio State. So like, it wasn't like you had to have this hypothetical debate the rest of the year. Like we were going to get a very important data point of how they matched up against a team that everyone thought was one of the best in the country, like days away. So that was really weird. And it was strange that Indiana became the flashpoint for all of it in general, because I always felt, and I still feel this way, that Penn State and Texas were way better examples of, okay, well, they haven't really played anybody. They don't really have any big wins like anchoring their resumes, but they didn't get pulled into this because we are used to talking about Penn State as one of the best teams in the country. And Texas was, number 1 in the country at one point. They're in the SEC, and a lot of this conversation was SEC people making it. But yeah, it was incredibly frustrating. And I really hate the idea of hypotheticals and Vegas lines as this integral part of college football discourse, because the whole point of an expanded playoff, maybe people will adapt now that we'll, actually go through this, is that you can play this stuff out on the field, right? If you don't think SMU is as good as the other teams in the playoff, or Indiana is, well, then they might lose. Like, they'll actually play on the game. Like, we don't have to do what we did with Florida State and Alabama last year, where you had to be like, oh, well, I think this team is better than that one, and that if they played, this would be the line. Well, you didn't get to play it out. Like, they weren't going to get a chance to decide that on the field. But this was so strange because you will. Like, if you personally don't believe that Indiana is good enough to beat these types of teams, well, you'll find out, because they're going to play Notre Dame, and that's that type of team, right? So that whole thing was really frustrating. And then I feel like my takes on it all aged really well, because the SEC teams kept losing.
Right. And
you just don't get an endless amount of mulligans and say that you're the best and say that you deserve to be in this. And I stand by this too. Like, it frustrates me to say, like, oh, we should have 4 or 5 teams in to the bracket. If you're finishing 5th place in your conference, why do you deserve a chance to play for a national championship? Like, you had a conference championship and you were that far back. So that stuff was really, really annoying to me. And I think that it will hopefully, I mean, I don't think it will reset things, but I do think, like, once we actually watch the games play out, maybe people will stop with the hypothetical conversations all regular season, because you do get answers to a lot of this in a way that we didn't before. And maybe, I guess, we'll never get one of like, oh, well, SMU, Alabama would have, done better than SMU, whatever. Again, don't lose 3 games. Don't get blown out by Oklahoma 2 weeks before the selection. They were in before that. It wouldn't have been a question. So that stuff just is frustrating. I do think the results need to matter. I think the fact that you lose a quarter of your games should matter. Yeah. So I do wish that the discourse around the college football playoff was different. And it was so weird that Indiana suddenly became like a polarizing team, because, again, I don't even think that you guys were the right flashpoint for that conversation. It should have been Penn State and Texas, and they didn't have like a game against Ohio State coming up at that point.
Right. Yeah, no, it's very odd, because, like, it felt like and look, IU hasn't really been able to participate in the national college football discussion, but we've been watching it, and it's like, gosh, every year before this year, losses mattered, wins mattered. Like, that was always the primary thing, and then the other stuff fell in afterwards, and then just randomly this year, that no longer became the primary metric. It was really fascinating. One other thing, just kind of big picture, is obviously Indiana has made this huge resource commitment now to Cignetti and his staff, and they've increased his salary to where it's top 10 or top 15. His assistant pool is huge now. It's such a huge change from how Indiana's treated this sport historically, but it's also like this very unique scenario where I saw this list the other day of the ages of the 12 coaches in the college football playoff. And, Kenny Dillingham's in his 30s, and you got a bunch of, Kirby's only like 44, and then get Curt Cignetti, who's 62 and about to turn 63.
Yeah, you needed Saban still in there to kind of like skew the ages.
But it highlights something we talked about earlier in the year, which is, it is really unusual for a Power 4 school to hire a coach that's over the age of like 55. And it's even more rare to hire a coach and let him bring his entire staff essentially from a group of 5 school. Like, I can't think of many other schools that would do that. And yet it creates the environment that you talked about at the beginning, where you've got like this unit that gets transported in with a bunch of players from James Madison, and they hit the ground running with the culture. Do you see that as being duplicatable ever again? I mean, this feels almost like a one of one to some degree.
Well, if you want to take credit for this, you should take credit for UNC hiring Bill Belichick at age 72 and letting him hire all his friends. So there you go.
That's it.
Basically exactly copy and pasted. No, and I don't know that it is something that people can duplicate, but every time this happens, someone who had success at a lower level and just clearly knows how to build a program and win games, you want more people to do it. I feel like we had this conversation with Chris Kleiman. We had this conversation with Lance Leipold, and it takes forever for these guys to get like that power conference opportunity, even though clearly what they're doing is working.
Yeah.
And I think if you can win at lower levels with less resources, you should be able to do it at higher levels with more resources.
I mean, Kalen DeBoer was a good example of that.
Kalen DeBoer,
too.
yes, exactly. Right. We had this exact conversation a year ago when Kalen DeBoer was in the national championship game. And yet, right? Like, and there's still questions and there's still doubts. And it's weird to me because I think a lot of it's just like this idea of exciting your fan base and like winning the press conference, the hot shot assistants, and some of them do pan out, right? Like you mentioned, Kenny Dillingham and Dan Lanning, like those were those young rising star guys, and they clearly work, and they're like really good for this era of college football. But I wish people would think a little bit more outside the box, because I do think someone who is winning at lower levels with the lack of resources, that to me, that's a plus. Like if you're looking at pros and cons for someone, I think, the idea that you learn so much about yourself by having this like kind of circuitous route to becoming a head coach for the first time, or just Cignetti's whole deal about like why he decided it was time to take a head coaching job, because he wasn't going to get an opportunity straight from Alabama. So you got to go to lower levels and learn some things, but you have the pedigree and the experiences at the high levels. To me, that stuff should be, we should be looking for more candidates like that. I remember talking to a couple agents about that. Like, hey, are people going to take anything away from Indiana's success and Cignetti's success? And there's not a lot. Like it's not like there's like 8 of, potential Cignettis out there that you're looking at. But I do think you can see guys at lower levels maybe get more opportunities. Like that's what I would take away from this. And especially managing a program and a roster in this day and age. Like JMU already was dealing with the portal, right? Your best players people are going to try to poach them. Yeah. Like you're already dealing with the roster management piece that everyone else is now dealing with at a higher level, but you were dealing with it for years. I remember doing a story on mid-major basketball programs like 12 years ago about how people were poaching and tracking grad transfers to try to take. Like you have that experience that only helps when you go to a higher level. But yeah, the age thing, all of that, all the things that we usually, maybe people are a little nervous about, they shouldn't be when you can get the right guy. And obviously Cignetti's energy and like the way that he talks about the program, the excitement he was able to build, that cancels out the idea of like, oh, the young fiery guy who's going to sell tickets. If you've got someone like Cignetti. But when you have a track record like that, you have a lot of things you can sell to. So I don't know that people will necessarily learn from this, but I do hope they look for people who have been head coaches at multiple levels, who have done this in harder jobs and are not afraid to take a job like this. That's why like Indiana is a perfect place for him, because a lot of coaches who maybe had let's say a better quote unquote pedigree, maybe they would have been like, oh, Indiana is a bad job, I'm not going to take it. But you have someone who's been in hard jobs, who's turned things around at hard places. So it's not as scary, which again is the kind of coach you should want anywhere.
Right. All right. Let's talk about the game. Let's talk about the matchup. So first of all, draw comes out last or 2 Sundays ago. You see Indiana at Notre Dame.
Loved it.
Why did you love it? What was it about that you loved?
Well, so I live in Chicago. Got lots of friends, got a couple cousins who went to Indiana. But I mean, like I've gone to Notre Dame a bunch. Like that is a very easy trip. So personally, selfishly, because this is all about us, as soon as Notre Dame beat USC, I was like, I will do the South Bend home game, because then I don't have to get on a plane. My other option, I was going to do State College. I wanted to be at one of the cold weather sites because I wanted like the full experience of the newness of this being in campus in December. So I was like, all right, lock it in for South Bend, and then see this matchup with a team that, again, we've covered very closely. Spent a lot of time with Cignetti, loved the story of this team and believed in them as a playoff potential team earlier than most. So this whole state of Indiana thing is just awesome. I mean, I think the idea of the proximity between these teams when you compare it to the other first round matchups, really appealing. And just all the comments we've gotten from Riley Leonard and everybody else about this is a basketball state, but like it's going to be a football state for a day and a night. So I just think it's awesome. And I think it's really cool that the very first of the 4 games is at an iconic stadium, and that you have, these in-state, I'm going to say in-state rivals. I know it's kind of like sounds weird for football
right
teams, but I just think it all is very, I like that it's all converging for this game in an iconic venue, and that for Indiana to continue this like magical season, you have to go through Notre Dame football to do it. And then, for Notre Dame, like the storylines of their season with NIU and everything else that they've gone through, also just really compelling. So I think it's a great matchup. And then you get into the actual X's and O's, and there's like a bunch of different matchups you're excited about in the actual game.
Yeah. Yeah. We talked about that a lot with some of our earlier preview podcasts. It's an odd game in that both these teams kind of did the same thing this year. They pulverized lesser opponents, but they had kind of different experiences elsewhere. Like Notre Dame lost to the worst team on their schedule.
Yep.
Indiana lost to the best team on their schedule. Notre Dame has looked impressive in a lot of games, but then there have been games like the USC game where it's like, well, it felt like they got a little lucky coming out of that one as opposed to necessarily dominating. And when we were talking about it on the preview pod on Tuesday, it's like these are almost like lab-grown teams in a lot of ways. The stats are crazy. It's strength on strength in a lot of cases, and it's really hard to tell exactly is superior because of how those statistics have been arrived at and who they've beaten and the way they've done it going through the season.
Right. But honestly, I still give a lot of credence to dominance and consistency because so many of the teams in the bracket have not been like that. Right. Yeah. Like I think, the fact that, again, the NIU loss was shocking, of course, and it was by far the worst loss of anyone in the playoff. But they've been so dominant since. And Indiana, same, like so dominant leading into, their first loss. That's hard to do. We talk about like strength of record and how, other teams would perform against your schedule. It's still really hard to win games. And it's really hard to win them like emphatically the way that we've seen these teams do because they've been doing it, on both sides of the ball. But I just think the consistency and the preparation week in and week out for these two teams has been at such a high level. And clearly this year, there have been a lot of inconsistent teams. There's been a lot of teams that have really struggled on the road. There are teams that just like it's not carrying over week to week. And for the most part, these two teams have not dealt with that, which I think is a huge credit to the mental toughness and the preparation from the coaches. But it is a really interesting matchup to your point about like, well, how much do you buy in certain things that are like their strengths or weaknesses if they were playing a lot of overmatched teams? But again, like we still have our eyes, right? We still saw what we saw. So when you say, okay, Notre Dame's got a great run game, Indiana's got the best run defense in the country, that's still a fascinating. Let's say maybe it's tweaked, because of the level of competition. Okay, so maybe they're like fifth best in the country. Reality, right? They're still elite there. So I still think you have those types of matchups that are going to be incredibly compelling, where you get those answers of like, okay, going up against like the best of the best, how does this strength match up? And that's what's fun because like you go through these first four playoff games, there are some where there's like total mismatches in certain parts of the game, but this like. That is such a fascinating one of strength on strength that I think is going to decide the game, certainly, but be really awesome. And then you have like the flip side of, okay, well, Notre Dame's defense is awesome. They've been elite, but they haven't really played a passing offense like Indiana's. So that's the unknown, right? Where again, you say, okay, they're great at this, but we also don't know if the level of competition, if they're going to be great. So it's really compelling, again, once you dive into the actual matchups, which is what's going to be so fun about this game. And I think this has really the potential to be the best of the first round games.
It's certainly been the first round game that there's been the least consensus on in terms of what people think is going to happen. I think for a lot of the reasons you just highlighted. I mean, in your preview this morning, you talked about, obviously, the one everybody's going to have to watch is Indiana's run defense versus Notre Dame's run offense. And I think that's clearly going to dictate so much of what happens in terms of, if the Irish are going to get out there and rush for 250 yards and score 3 or 4 touchdowns on the ground, Indiana probably isn't going to be able to keep up with that. Right. Except Indiana's passing game, which kind of took a couple of weeks off there because of issues with protection and whatnot. They addressed some things in the Purdue game, and then they've had 2 weeks to kind of work on what went wrong in those Michigan and Ohio State games. That was the bread and butter for Indiana for most of the first 2/3 of the season. Beating Maryland, they beat Northwestern that way, they beat Nebraska that way. If that comes back, that's not necessarily something Notre Dame's seen, except in the USC game where it was clearly a problem. They got a little lucky with the turnovers, but that's probably the X factor as far as I'm concerned. It's like, can Indiana move the ball in the air?
Yeah,
that's the big thing that helps to counter what Notre Dame might be able to do on the ground.
Right. And like the time that they'd be able to take off the clock and kind of the control of the game. Yeah. I mean, that's the question. I would turn this around to you since you're, so plugged in on Indiana. how concerned are you with those 6 quarters, right? The second quarter, the second half against Michigan, and the first 4 quarters against Ohio State? Because so many people are making so much about those were when they played pros. Those are when they played the type of athlete they're going to play against Notre Dame. Like, can they elevate? Can they play better? I mean, you said you saw improvements against Purdue, which is not the same level, but is there enough that they can do like for this defensive front?
I mean, I think there is. And now, will it be actually enough is an open question. But, so many of the problems in the Ohio State game were different than the problems in the Michigan game. Like, Michigan just out-physicaled Indiana in the second half. And Ohio State, while they did do that as the game went along, a lot of it was because Indiana was unprepared for the environment they were playing
100%. And like the turnovers are just uncharacteristic.
And the thing people haven't talked about, but I was there sitting in the stands watching the game. The rain in the second quarter absolutely destroyed Indiana's ability to catch the ball or throw the ball. When you added on top of that the dropped punt and also just Ohio State teeing off on their offensive line when they couldn't provide the protection adjustments, they're not going to really deal with that. Like, this is it's one of the interesting things about this. Like, it's a much smaller stadium. Still a loud stadium, but not loud to the level that Ohio Stadium is loud. You've got 30-some thousand fewer seats. You're going to have I think a decent number of IU fans in the building, which will also change the atmosphere a little bit. And ultimately, if Indiana hasn't established a shorter passing game or something where there are some clear dump-offs and red flag, like, okay, they've got 7 coming, we've got to get the ball out. If they haven't made those adjustments, they probably don't have a chance to address those issues. But I got to think, with the amount of time they've had since those games, that's been a primary thing for them, is figuring out how to adjust in those circumstances.
Yeah. That's the thing. Like, the coaching staffs and the chess match here is also really, really interesting. Again, because like they're both going to be in positions where they're going to have to do some things that maybe they didn't have to do a lot in the regular season because, again, the way that they were winning the games. And that's what's going to be really interesting. I'm with you. I mean, I'm sure they figured some stuff out. And especially with, the physicality on the line, like, how do you, like you said, the dump offs, get behind it a little bit or get, the ball out a little bit in space. And that's the question too. Like, the 2 questions for Notre Dame, because again, been incredibly impressed with them. Sorry for everyone who's listening. I did pick Notre Dame to win this game because they make you do a bracket and they make you make picks. But here are the 2 questions. 1, I don't know if Notre Dame goes down 14-0 early or something like that, which we've seen Indiana jump on people early, so very possible. Can they throw their way back into a game? Can Riley Leonard, as a passer, do that? He's a great, great runner, and they had great moments in the pass game. But again, you were playing overmatched teams. They're pretty wide open receivers in those moments as well. So can he do that if the game needs to go on his arm and not his legs? And they can't just feed Jeremiah Love. So we don't know that. And then again, we don't know what this defense looks like against a great offense and a great quarterback. Like, with the pass game is so important on the other side. Because they've had games where they were, they forced a lot of turnovers. So that's something you got to watch out for. Obviously, you don't want to do that. That was a problem against Ohio State. You don't want to hurt yourself. Right. But those are 2 really significant X factors of things that we don't know about Notre Dame that could certainly play into this game, because both of these teams in a lot of their games got leads and just like foot on the gas pedal. Yep. So what happens if that doesn't happen? That's what's going to be really, really interesting. And then the weather factor of, like, you mentioned kind of the rain at Ohio Stadium. If it's really cold, first of all, I really hope it's going to snow. I know the forecast is not looking like it's going to actually flurry during the game.
It's going to be close. We've got they're up to about a half inch of projected snowfall during the day. So we'll see.
I just want like a dusting during the game for the scene. I just want it to look.
You weren't down at the Purdue game, but that's
the weather. That's the weather.
The snow globe style game. Absolutely.
Exactly. That's what I want for at least one of these playoff games. But does that end up impacting the pass game, right? On both sides. So again, like, these are really interesting questions just because of what we think we know about the teams and what we think we don't know about the teams.
Yeah. Yeah. And the weather is the other factor. To me, it's less the snow, it's the wind. Yeah. And what does that look like in terms of the passing game? But there's 2 things I'll stop on here. A, if it is a close game late, Indiana's played in one of those relatively recently. The Michigan game was very tight through the fourth quarter. They did figure out a way to win. Now, that was at home, but at least they've been in that condition. They've also been in a more hostile stadium recently, whereas Notre Dame's only played I mean, they're going to be playing at home. It doesn't matter, but that's not an experience they've necessarily had to deal with. And the other one is simply like, as you said earlier, because we haven't seen these teams necessarily go up against other great teams in the same way where they're matched like these two teams are, it is going to really be interesting to see who's able to establish early and what does that do to the psyche of the opposition. And I think both these teams are they're pretty confident in themselves and they're pretty confident in what they can do. It's to me, it's like who can keep from getting knocked down emotionally early on. If this is really competitive, I think, either team can thrive. And it's hard to say at this point which one, because they both bring a lot to the table.
I agree. And I think they both have gotten knocked down and had to learn something about themselves. Like, I think, obviously Notre Dame's been very well established, but like the fact that they have basically been playing playoff games since mid-September because they knew they couldn't lose again. No. That is something they did not overlook anyone the rest of the way after they overlooked Northern Illinois, right? They learned something about themselves in that game. And then, Riley Leonard, again, I feel like a lot of people overreacted a lot to the early part of the season with him as a passer, where he missed all of spring. He was injured. He had to work his way back in. So you saw him get more comfortable as the season went on. And then the flip side with Indiana, going through what they went through against Michigan and then in Ohio State, it's a very interesting experience to go through. Everyone's been patting you on the back. Everyone's been saying great things, but we don't know what we don't know. And then you get punched in the mouth and then you respond against Purdue. Now you have this opportunity to respond again with a coaching staff and a team that, again, is so well prepared. I think it's so obvious when you see this team, especially in first quarters, how prepared and confident they are in their game plan, but also you don't see dumb penalties. That's why the Ohio State stuff was so weird to see, like special teams mistake, because you just don't see it out of this team. So they believe every single time they step on the field, they belong. So you have these factors that like really, like if you are a fan of both these teams, you feel really good, I think, coming into this game because you just know the identities of your team. And you're right. Like what happens to the team, that gets punched in the mouth first? Who scores first? Who's on their heels first? Who has the turnover first? How do they respond to that? That's what's so interesting about this one. I honestly, as you can tell, I can't wait. I can't wait to get down south.
I can't wait either. I'm leaving right after this. I'm driving up there.
I love it. I'm heading either tonight or tomorrow morning, but it's gonna be really, really fun. And I just think there's no shortage of storylines. There's no shortage of ways where you can be like, I think if X, Y, and Z happens, this team wins. But if A, B, and C do, it's the other. There's so many different ways that this game could go. And so I think that's why, as soon as I saw the matchup, I thought it was going to be awesome. I thought it had potential to be the best of the first four games. And certainly just from a narrative standpoint of what it means for both of these programs to potentially get a win in the college football playoff. It's awesome. This is why I wanted the expanded playoff. This is why I wanted games on campus. So it's kind of like a dream scenario, I think, when you look at the first round.
Couldn't agree more, and couldn't be looking more forward to this experience. And Nicole, certainly appreciate you taking the time to talk with us on Crimson Cast today. Thank you for your coverage throughout the season, and we'll look forward to following you throughout the course of the playoff.
Absolutely. See you there in South Bend.
We'll see you there. All right, my thanks again to Nicole Auerbach of NBC Sports, and appreciate her comments and insight on what to expect in this game and just overall about what we heard and saw with the IU football season. We're going to go ahead and wrap things up. And again, we look forward to seeing you folks up in South Bend. It should be a blast. We're really looking forward to it. I guess, all these podcasts throughout the course of the week, I've been holding off on my score prediction. I'll go ahead and give it here. And, I've gone back and forth on this a bunch. I do believe that this is going to be a close game. It's going to be a game where there's going to be moments where both teams are taken aback by what's happening. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge how good Notre Dame is, the talent that they've got on the field. I think that the folks that have pointed out that Notre Dame has a lot of things going for them in terms of, being such a good rushing attack and how efficient they've been. I think there's certainly a lot to that, but I really like Indiana in this. And I think Indiana, they've had a lot of time to sit around since that Ohio State game and think about what do we do if we're in this position again, where we're playing a big opponent on the road. Can we execute better? And I think they're going to find a way to do it. I think it's going to be tight. I think it'll be low scoring to start with. I think it'll pick up a bit in the second half. So I'm going to say Indiana wins this one by the final score of 31-27. I think it's going to be real close. It's going to be right around where that over-under mark has been set. I guess a little bit higher if it's 31-27. But I really think, if Indiana can get their passing game rolling early on and establish that, it adds a dimension that I think they'll be able to take advantage of. Ultimately, it's going to come down to the line play on both sides and what Indiana is going to be capable of doing there. But I have faith in the guys, and I have faith in the coaching staff being able to figure out a way to deal with not just the elements, but also deal with a talented Notre Dame team. So 31-27, my score prediction, and I'm anxious to hear what yours is out there in the audience. So we'll see what happens, but it's been a great season for IU, and looking forward to it continuing after the game on Friday night as Indiana takes on the Fighting Irish in the college football playoff first round. That'll wrap it up for us. My thanks to everybody for being involved, not just today, but throughout the course of the week and the season, as we've really had a lot of fun talking about this IU football team and looking forward to continuing to do that. My thanks to Home Field Apparel, our presenting sponsor. We'll see you folks either tonight, Thursday night at Corby's, or on Friday at Social Cantina. I'm Galen Clavio. This is Crimson Cast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.